to my colleagues across the Australian Public Service and welcome to the Connecting Us podcast. My name is Mif Nazette and I work at PM&C in the Connecting Us editorial team. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this continent and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So in this edition of Connecting Us, we're looking at the work of the APS around the world and what our colleagues get up to in all different countries to further Australia's national interest. And with me today to talk about this by phone, I've got Australia's ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman and Yemen, Ridwaan Jadwat. Thanks for chatting with us today, Ridwaan. And I believe it's bright and early in the morning in Riyadh right now.
Thank you, Mif. Yes, it is. It's about 8:15 in the morning here in Riyadh, sunny Riyadh, and probably about 34 degrees already.
It's a little bit chillier here in Canberra. It's a lovely rainy afternoon. So I'm just going to jump right in and throw one of your own quotes to you, if that's okay.
Sure.
About a year or so ago, you gave a speech to the DFAT Global Heads of Mission meeting. And in that you said, "I look out the window of the residence in Riyadh every day and I see the Australian flag fluttering outside. And I sometimes have to pinch myself to think that my adopted country valued me enough to dispatch an immigrant like myself to faraway lands to represent the Australian government and its people." So I'm just wondering if you can tell us a bit about how you and your family came to Australia and what that means for your life and your work today.
Okay, thank you, Mif, and I'm really honoured to be part of this conversation. I was 9 years old when my family immigrated to Australia from apartheid South Africa. So we left South Africa because of apartheid and the discrimination that we continued to live under the system of racial segregation. My family was classified as non-white and we lived in a segregated area of Durban, and I was attending a school for non-whites, and racial mixing, of course, at that time was a crime, and our entire lives were defined by racial segregation. So, for example, I had to catch a bus to school for non-whites, we had to avoid the whites-only toilets and restaurants. Essentially, our whole lives were dominated by apartheid. And so it was a very dehumanizing existence for our family. And of course, my parents were determined to escape apartheid and they applied to immigrate to Australia. And we were lucky enough to be accepted to immigrate in 1981. So in that speech last year, I spoke about how we came to Australia, the immigration process, and how, for example, the first white person that I ever had a chance to speak to was the Australian diplomat who came to interview us in Durban to see whether our family was successful in terms of the application process. And that Australian diplomat, of course, was the first Australian I ever spoke to, as well as the first white person I spoke to because of apartheid. And at that time, of course, I could not have imagined that one day I would end up becoming an Australian diplomat. So in that sort of speech, I sort of drew on that experience to talk about how we came to Australia, but also what Australia meant to us in terms of its values, in terms of opening up its society to immigrants like ourselves. And as a sort of a brown Muslim family from South Africa arriving in Australia in 1981, it was, of course, a cultural shock, living under apartheid and coming to a brand new country. And so for me, that sort of story and my history in terms of where I came from has shaped me in many ways. It's left an indelible impression on myself and on my family. And in many ways, it's shaped who I am now and also how I work, because it's motivated me to try and always build bridges between different cultures. And as a diplomat, I've drawn on that to sort of promote the Australian values of multiculturalism and cultural and religious diversity wherever I am posted around the world or in my sort of day-to-day work. So our story of immigrating from South Africa to Australia remains, for me, a sort of a foundation stone, if you like, in terms of who I am and what I try to represent on a daily basis.
Okay, wow, that's quite a story. This is something that I have no personal experience with, having grown up in Australia. What was it like for you and your family arriving on the plane to Australia? What were your first impressions? How were you received by the people around you?
It was a shock to the system in many ways because we'd been so confined to racially segregated suburbs in South Africa, so that when we arrived in Australia, we were told that you could basically go anywhere and you could speak to anyone. And I remember the first thing that shocked me was when we got off the plane and we were in the car. And I remember the car stopped on the way to get petrol, and we saw that, there were no... The sort of system of apartheid was obviously where Africans and non-white people were always serving serving white people. And then when we arrived, we saw that it was a country where there were that sort of system was obviously not evident. And I was as a young child, I could see that the society operated in a very different way, and it was refreshing, and it was also very emotional for us to see that we were no longer going to be classified as second-class citizens. So that first sort of drive from the airport, I could just sort of look out the window and could see, at the petrol station, that there were white people who were serving us, and that, we were no longer in a society where we were going to be dehumanized because of the color of our skin. So even from that first trip out from the airport, I could already sense that something was different about this place. But as children, it was not particularly easy at the beginning because we had to sort of come out of our shells and we had to sort of learn to live in a new society, a new culture, and we had to stop thinking about things in terms of race because that was all we could do when we were in South Africa. So when I was a child and started going to school for the first time in Australia, and then I was, of course, shocked to go to school with white kids, because I'd never had that opportunity before, and to have a white teacher and for people to talk to me about things and not to think about things in terms of white or non-white. So that was all something, it was quite a lot to absorb as a 9 and 10-year-old. But it's always stayed with me in the sense that it's sort of, as I said earlier, shaped who I am in terms of how I see the world and how my family sees the world. And so for me, it remains something that I always draw on in my life because I can't forget who I am and how I came to Australia. And through the opportunities that I've been given as an Australian ambassador, for example, I could never have imagined as a young child arriving in Australia for the first time that one day I would represent Australia overseas and have a flag on my car and a flag in the lounge room or outside. So in that speech to the Global Heads of Mission meeting last year, I tried to give them a personal sense of how that affects me, that it's not just a symbol, but it's also something that touches your soul, to have the honor and the privilege of representing your country, your adopted country, overseas. So it means a lot to me. It remains something that I feel quite emotional about, and my family does as well. And for my parents, when they first came to visit me here in Riyadh, they were also very, I think, emotionally touched by the fact that there's an Australian flag in the lounge room and their son is the Australian ambassador.
Yeah,
so,
it must have been really special.
Absolutely.
So from what you're saying, this is really a part of who you are and what you bring to your work and every aspect of your life. And going back to that Global Heads of Mission speech that you made, you were talking about how diversity and multiculturalism aren't just added extras that we can have as a society, if we have time or if we feel like it. You were talking about how it is absolutely fundamental to who we are as Australians, and obviously who you are as a person. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about what you mean by that, it being fundamental to us as Australians and as a society.
Sure. Well, what I meant by that was it's absolutely multiculturalism and our diversity, the richness of our diversity. It's fundamental to who we are as a people and where we are going into the future. And I drew upon a quote from our former Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser, who said, "Multiculturalism is concerned with far more than the passive toleration of diversity. It sees diversity as a quality to be actively embraced, a source of social wealth and dynamism." And I think that point remains relevant more so than ever. I mean, we're a country with a very proud Indigenous history that stretches back 65,000 years. We're a country in which 28% of Australians were born overseas, and around 50% of Australians have a parent born overseas. And that I think, is a multicultural gold mine. And what we've managed to do in Australia remains a remarkable achievement. And that diversity of faiths and colours and creeds, I think it's the true essence of what makes us a modern and vibrant nation, and it's an asset that we have in this world. And I think that we need to seize that opportunity and seize that or harness that multicultural reality and make the most of it. It's something that we can be very proud of, but it's also something that we can't take for granted. We have to keep working at it, and I think we can draw more and more on that diversity to enrich ourselves as a society. And I think we're certainly doing that in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade as we become a more diverse department, and our secretary and the leadership of the department remains committed to a diverse department that brings out the best of this community and also is representative of Australia as we are today.
Right. And so with all the changes that have happened in 2020 and I guess our global outlook changing so much, the fact that borders are closing, we can't travel as we used to, we can't contact people in the ways that we used to do, and even things like, the potential rise of things like vaccine nationalism. I guess all those things could sort of push us as a society and as individuals more towards being inward focused or even potentially protectionist. So how do we, I guess, as individuals or as APS officers, continue to embrace multiculturalism in the face of all these changes and threats to that?
Well, I think it's important that we don't lose sight, during this horrific year, this global pandemic, we don't lose sight of what brings us together, what connects us as fellow human beings. And I think if we draw on those strengths in Australia, that diversity, that richness of our multicultural society, that helps us when we connect with the rest of the world in terms of our interconnectedness, in terms of our ability to understand different cultures and societies. So I think we can draw on those strengths in a time of adversity like we're currently going through at the moment. And of course, we should continue to strive to remain connected with people through this sort of period. Obviously virtual diplomacy and sort of online meetings are now, a regular part of our day-to-day lives. And certainly here at the embassy, we've done the very best we can to remain connected, not only with our staff internally in the mission, when we've had, for example, lockdowns because of a rise in cases, as we did in sort of May and June. We, even though the staff were not coming into work, we continued to have regular sort of virtual or online meetings and regular all-staff meetings just to check up on everyone and make sure that we're all doing okay. So I think it remains incumbent upon all of us, whether we're leaders or members of different departments or agencies, to continue to sort of work with one another and to make sure that we don't lose sight of each other and of different societies, during this period of this pandemic. We should see it as an opportunity to try and focus on people who remain vulnerable. So, for example, I think Australia has made it very clear that we will continue to do whatever we can in terms of the possible development of a vaccine to make sure that it's distributed in the developing world and that there's fair and equitable access to things like that. And I think that's an important message to send to the rest of the world.
Okay, so you talked a little bit there about some of the practical changes you've had to make in your mission and in your diplomacy. Are there any other changes that have come about this year, that I guess are less tangible? For example, maybe different approaches you've had to take or different strategies you've had to employ to be able to continue to do diplomacy in this whole new world?
Sure. Well, obviously the online sort of meetings have become a new way of doing things. And, using technology to engage our contacts, throughout Saudi Arabia and the countries of our accreditation. But also what we've had to do is sort of double down on our social media messaging to make sure that we are still connecting with key audiences during the pandemic and with people throughout our countries of accreditation. And of course, doing whatever we can to support Australians who remain keen to leave Saudi Arabia or the other countries. And so, for example, earlier this year, the embassy was heavily involved in helping to facilitate some special commercial flights to get Australians home, during the pandemic. So focusing on how we reach out to our community, Australian community, but also how we focus on our sort of foreign interlocutors, how we remain in touch with them, and make sure that the pandemic doesn't in any way damage our ability to stay connected and to reach out to the communities and to our interlocutors that remain critical to the operations of this embassy. So it's really given us a challenge that we've had to overcome, but I think it also has focused us as a team on what we need to do to help each other. And I think teamwork and staying in touch with each other and focusing on how as a team we support one another has also become a really important part of what we do, so that people don't feel in any way that this pandemic leaves them isolated or disconnected from the embassy or from their colleagues.
And are there any particular strategies that you've taken personally? I assume that you have family back here in Australia. What have you done to keep in touch with the people that you care about?
Well, lots of FaceTimes and WhatsApp video messages. And so I've tried to do that not only with my family in Australia, but also with a family that I continue to have in South Africa and with friends around the world. And in many ways, we're doing more and more video sort of messaging and video chats with friends and family. And so that continues to now be a regular part of our life. But I found it very difficult. My family, unfortunately, at the moment are not here because my daughter was finishing high school last year and my son's in university. So they're both now in university. And my wife was at home in Australia to make sure that she was there to support my daughter as she went through her final year of high school. So unfortunately, because of COVID, they have not been able to travel here, and I haven't been able to see them since April of this year. So it's put a sort of heavy burden on lots of families throughout the DFAT network as people are unable to see their families. And so we try to stay connected, and we strive to do the best we can to keep in touch with our families, but it just adds to the sort of pressures that one faces in this sort of current context. So I know I'm not alone in that. There's lots and lots of families, throughout DFAT and of course through the broader world where people are unable to see their family and their friends. But hopefully we can all remain connected through technology. But it doesn't. It certainly doesn't replace having a hug with your kids or your parents.
That's right.
In the current context. So I'm certainly hoping that I'll be able to see my family at the end of the year and to reunite.
Yeah. So when the pandemic hit, did you have to make a choice as to whether you stayed where you are in Riyadh or whether you came home, or?
Well, actually, I was in Australia at the time visiting my family, and I was there for a medical procedure in Australia at the time in February, and so the pandemic sort of hit at that time when I was still in Australia, and then I had to try and get back to Riyadh to assume my role again as ambassador. So it was difficult to get back here because of the border closures and the lack of international flights. But I felt it was my duty and my responsibility to return back to Riyadh as soon as I could, and to be with the team and to make sure we saw this challenge through together. And so that was quite an effort, but it led to a severe disruption in our team. We had my colleague, our first secretary, was also trapped outside of Saudi Arabia, and her family were sort of spent 7 months, I think, unfortunately, outside of Riyadh, and were only able to return recently. So it's had an enormous impact on people's lives and on their families, and I think it just only focuses us on the fact that we need to work together as a team and we see each other here in this embassy as an extended family. I certainly feel that we should operate in a way where we look out for each other constantly, and we have a family sort of atmosphere here. We used to have these regular potluck lunches in the ambassador's residence as a way of remaining connected with each other before COVID. And now we do things like virtual lunches, and we had a virtual iftar during Ramadan for the first time. So we've had to find new and innovative ways of staying connected and socializing with our team so that we continue to have a good laugh and continue to sort of stay in touch with each other and what we're all doing. So that remains an ongoing sort of effort to keep in touch with people and make sure people feel like we're there for them. It's a really important part, I think, of being a leader in the public service, but also being obviously an ambassador here at an embassy.
Yeah. So sorry, forgive my ignorance. What's an iftar?
Oh, iftar is the breaking of the fast during Ramadan. So during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, our staff, most of our staff here at the embassy are Muslim and were fasting, like myself. And during Ramadan, at sunset, you break your fast of the day. And normally in Riyadh, the embassy would host iftars for our staff and for our contacts. This year, unfortunately, because of COVID, we were not able to do that. And so we did it virtually online, and we had everyone connected on WebEx, and we had videos of all of us breaking fast at our individual homes with lots of different food.
Lovely.
So instead of sharing the food physically, we shared it virtually, but it was still
it's
a chance.
It's not quite the same, but it's better than nothing.
It's not the same, unfortunately, but it at least allowed us to see each other. No, absolutely not. But we had a good time, and I certainly hope that next year we won't be in the same situation, and hopefully, inshallah, as they say in this part of the world, that we'll be able to reunite and have an iftar in person.
Well, let's hope. Now, just to finish up, I read somewhere that you got to meet Nelson Mandela once. How did that happen? What was that like?
Sure. Well, I was 18 years old at the time. I was in the final weeks of high school. I was attending Casula High in Sydney's southwestern suburbs. It was the 24th of October, 1990, and Nelson Mandela had been released from prison that year. And he was visiting Australia to thank the Australian people for their support of the anti-apartheid movement. And a family friend told me that he was helping to organize that visit, and would I be interested in maybe having the opportunity to meet Nelson Mandela. And even though it was the day before my HSC and my first English exam, I was determined that I was going to be there to see him in person and hopefully have the chance to actually meet him. So I attended the speech he delivered at the Sydney Opera House that day, and I was in the crowd of about 40,000 people that were cheering him and singing and celebrating his release from prison. And then I attended an ecumenical service at St. Mary's Cathedral. I actually had a chance to meet him there, but it was only later that night at a reception at the Hilton Hotel where he was meeting some people in person. And I was given the job of checking people's tickets that night when he arrived. And so he came up the escalator, and I sort of felt like I was in another world. And then I saw him, and I went up to him and I told him about who I was, and that I was also someone who had lived under apartheid, and that he was a hero of mine. And I asked if I could hug him. He gave me a big hug, and he flashed that fantastic smile of his. And it was an incredible moment, very emotional for me. He was a man that I'd always admired. And of course, when we lived in South Africa under apartheid, we were not even allowed to mention his name. I mean, he was a banned person, and he was in prison. Really? And so to actually meet him, someone who inspired me to later study law and to sort of focus on things like diversity and reconciliation between people and to do whatever we can to build bridges between different cultures. He was in many ways an inspiration for me and remains so today. And I think his dignity and his essential decency and goodness is something that we can all hope, to learn from. And so when I had that opportunity to meet him, to hug him, and I told him how much I admired him and how much I loved him for what he had done to help free, the people of South Africa, it was something that was absolutely unforgettable. And I remain very lucky and privileged to have had the chance to meet such a great human being.
Oh, that sounds incredible. And They say you should never meet your heroes, but it sounds like it was pretty good for you.
It certainly was. And, I think if you get a chance to meet your heroes, you obviously hold on to those memories. And in some ways, for me, I continue to hold on to it in my heart. And I always see him as someone to emulate and someone to try and see as a role model. So I think that his legacy remains a great one, and he remains a great figure in world history.
Okay, well, that's about all we've got time for. Was there anything else that you wanted to add that we haven't covered yet?
Sure. I mean, I think in terms of talking about the public service and talking about our careers, I mean, for me, the opportunity to serve in DFAT and also to have a secondment to Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet for 3 years, where I had the chance to work with the Prime Minister and to serve as an advisor on foreign policy and to help write speeches and sit in bilateral meetings with world leaders, and then in my postings in DFAT in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, in Malaysia. It's all been, for me, a fantastic ride and adventure, but it's also been a great opportunity to serve the Australian people. And I still believe in that ideal of the public service and of serving our people. And for me, I can say that the career in the public service has been an extraordinary experience for me, and also for my family and for my children and for my wife. Being representatives of Australia overseas, we've had the chance to do so much, and I would really recommend, I continue to recommend to children all over the country, whenever I get a chance to meet kids or high school students or university students, to say, try and seek a career in the public service. And for me, of course, a career in DFAT and also that secondment at PMNC has meant a great deal to me, and it continues to remain an extraordinary experience, and I continue to enjoy every day when I'm serving here in Riyadh as the Australian ambassador, and in many ways you become a symbol of 25 million people every day. So I take that responsibility seriously, but it also remains a great source of joy and excitement to serve Australia and to work as a diplomat. So for me, I think we should continue to promote the ideals of the public service and to try and encourage people to have a stint in the APS. I think it's a great thing to do.
Thanks so much for your time today, Ridwaan, and for sharing your incredible perspective on the work of the APS around the world. It's been really inspiring. I guess we'll let you go start your day now.
Look, thank you so much, Miff. It's been a real pleasure and wonderful to talk to you. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you in person when I'm back in Canberra.
Sounds great. And thanks everyone for listening to our podcast today. Don't forget to check out the latest edition of Connecting Us for more stories from your APS colleagues serving all around the world. Catch you next time.
Today's show was written and presented by Mif Nazet, with editorial input from Richard Zilkowski. Dan Unsworth did the sound editing, with original music by Ed Reading. Special thanks to Ambassador Ridwaan Jadwat and Melissa Kelly at the Australian Embassy in Riyadh. Thanks for listening. We look forward to sharing more APS stories